I'm Samson Young. I'm here in Dubai at the Jameel Art Center to set up for a show which is opening in a couple of days. Um, and I'm here in the wonderful library of the center to do some reading in response to um, a couple of books in the collection that I have read, and also related to some works that I've done before. And I'm responding to them by not reading from these books that are in the collection, but rather books that are read at around the same time, or responding to these books that are in the collection. So the first book that I'll be responding to today is this book by Jane Martin Daughtry, Listening to Wall. There were a couple of years around the year 2013 and 14. It really started in 2012, but around those couple of years when there was a lot happening in Hong Kong, and I was beginning to become interested in the relationship between sound and conflict, and it is something that seemed quite it's not something that you think about really in Hong Kong, but it was starting to become like conflict, and was starting to become a part of public discussion more. And so this book is it's filled with really personal accounts. This book has describes and chronicles the experience of conflict by people who are actually experiencing it on the ground, from civilians learning to and thinking about listening to the different artilleries and the sounds of different weapons, to military personnel and their music playlists. So it's really a kind of an alternative way of writing a history and experience of conflict from the perspective of listening, which is also something that was becoming more popular in writing. People were beginning to discover different senses as a way of writing a history. So there was an interesting chapter in this that talked about the playlist of U.S. military personnel during the Gulf War, and that period actually also coincided with the popularization of iPod, actually. So people would be like, so playlists on personal digital players were beginning to be a thing that people would pack on packing lists. So this book, but I'm not reading from this book. I want to talk about another book, which is something that I also read around that time, which is Steve Goodman's Sonic Warfare. So it talks about the it's more specific in that it discusses in a lot of instances the actual use of sound in conflict, and by extension also how artists have been involved, and in some cases complicit in these conflicts. So it's more specific than this book. Another book that I would also recommend on this topic is David Tube's Sinister Resonance, and it's broader and more general, but it's a kind of a meditation on the idea that resonances reverberation or senses of hearing. There could be a sinister side to it as well. So that's also a really good book. But I want to read two excerpts from this Steve Goodman book. The full title is Sonic Warfare, Sound Effect, and the Ecology of Fear. I'm going to read two excerpts from this book. One excerpt is the chapter on chapter 7 from this book, which is on the Ghost Army, which is an actual unit within the U.S. Army, which are actually staffed by people who worked in theater, people who were sound engineers, essentially people who are involved in art, but actually as a part of what are later known as Ghost Army. And this was actually not declassified until the 2010s, so quite recent. And then I want to read also another excerpt from this book, which is from chapter 12, the chapter called Bad Vibrations. So this in a way echoes David Tube's book, Sinister Resonance. I'm going to just read the end of that chapter. So, but I'll begin with chapter 7. So there are probably going to be mispronunciation and hiccups and all that, because it's not my native language, and I get very anxious reading English, but I'll do my best for legibility. So chapter 7, the Ghost Army. Ghost Army was the nickname given to a division of the U.S. Army, the 23rd Special Troops, stationed in Europe during World War II. They consisted of artists deployed in the fabrication of camouflage and fake inflatable equipment, and the sound and radio engineers using equipment pioneered at Bell Labs. The Ghost Army's aims were to trick the enemy into reacting against the presence of a non-existent phantom army using the sound of troops, tanks, and landing craft, allowing the actual troops to maneuver elsewhere. In addition to the Ghost Army, Division 17 was working on a joint Army-Navy project based on the psychological and physiological effects of men in warfare. Research orchestrated by Bell Telephone Labs and consisting of physiologists and sound engineers, including the inventor of the new stereophonic system that made possible the recording of music for Walt Disney's Fantasia. In a short excerpt of archive footage from an Army training film during World War II, an engineer is shown cutting a dupe plate of sound effects, such as bulldozers, the construction of a bridge, and an armored column of troops. The records were then filed at a library at the Army Experimental Station and re-recorded in sequence onto wire. The engineer is filmed mixing down a soundtrack onto a wire recording using 3 turntables. The sonic deception involved in the generation and distribution of sounds to produce the sonic experience of the battlefield in order to confuse, mislead, or distract the enemy, blending actual recording and artificially generated noise. It was targeted at the enemy's ears and listening devices. The less effective the enemy's visual capabilities, the the more powerful sonic deceptions could be. Visual concealment by smoke or the dark of night obviously assisted the process. Moreover, climate and geography intimately affected the range of signals. Based on the intricate logic of sonic effects, the sound ranging of the enemy attempted to estimate the distance of the sound sources. For example, the Doppler effect dictated that sound increasing in frequency was approaching and sound decreasing in frequency was retreating. Such a manipulation of frequencies was therefore deployed to trick the enemy, or was deliberately avoided in the recording of sound effects. Yet in practice, this was unreliable and required the enemy to remain relatively static. The techniques of sonic deception derived from an accident. It was noticed that when dive bombers came plunging from the sky, with the characteristic scream whine caused by a siren deliberately designed into the aircraft, it was instilled a paralyzing panic in those on the ground. For Division 17 of the National Research Defense Committee, the lesson was clear: sound could terrorize soldiers. So they decided to take the concept to the next level and develop a sonic bomb. The idea of a sonic bomb never quite panned out, so the engineers shifted their work towards battlefield deception. Sonic deception therefore emerged out of the power of audible vibrations to generate an effective ecology of fear. The sonic manipulation of the enemy involved a number of key tactics of frequency to produce virtual sound. To create a phantom army in sound, its presence had to be fabricated using what is often referred to as the acoustic intimacy of binaural hearing. That is, the ear serve as two input channels for sound, and together they create a whole virtual field. Quote, "Hearing is imperfect and can be fooled, especially when other senses, such as sight, are also involved. We do not hear in the precise way an oscilloscope measures sound waves. How and what we hear depends on context, both physical and emotional. Presence emerged as the complex result of improvement in several key components of the sound recording and playback system. First, the recordings themselves were purer, clean of masking sound or the obtrusive background noise. Second, the individual sound effects were mixed into multiple channels and then played back through multiple speakers, both on a single vehicle or vehicles separated by hundreds of yards. The psychoacoustical effects was that as sound moved between speakers, the listener heard a phantom sound, a sonic illusion, but one that did not jump from one sound source to another. Rather, it lingered in the space between two speakers, creating a sense of spatial reality for the sound. The speaker itself evolved from a rigid metallic horn that gave off volume but sounded tiny and flat like a megaphone. Now a larger, flexible speaker came into play. Its 15-inch diameter allowed it to handle bass or low frequency sound waves. Frequency response was richer. Natural harmonics of a sound, sometimes called overtones. To the human ear, those overtones, which resonate at mathematically predictable frequency intervals, and not usually audible as separate sounds. The impression that sound was coming not just from the speaker itself, but also from beside it and behind it. End quote. As sonic deception became taken more seriously, it fed into the improvement of speaker technology. As Bell Labs noted, in World War II, the new military acoustic devices were not just copies or minor physical modification of existing instruments, but rather basically new designs. In fact, because of their newfound fidelity to presence, they would become popular in the civilian world after the war in stereo hi-fi system and studio monitors. Aside from new innovation in sound technology, older devices such as the magnetic wire recorder were dusted off to solve the problem of skipping phonograph needles in mobile vehicles in the field. During the 1930s, Hitler's Ministry of Information and Propaganda was deploying wire recorders to deceive listeners about his actual location by playing pre-recorded speeches on the radio and pretending that they were live broadcasts. The tactics and technology of sonic deception, therefore, add yet another instance to Hitler's notion that popular sonic media entail the misuse of military technologies. And these techniques of virtual sound serve as a precedent to the deployment within the US invasion of Iraq and more recent military research into directional sonic lasers. So this was the chapter on the ghost. A fascinating piece of history for sure. I wanna also read a short excerpt from another chapter, Bad Vibration. A lot of what I've been working on more recently, it's sort of the psychology and fear and anxiety. So this chapter is actually something that I did not read when I was, or at least I did not remember that there's no notes on this chapter when I was originally in contact with this book and sort of using it for the work. And for this reading, I sort of went back to it and noticed how this chapter is maybe speaking more to the sort of things that I'm dealing with and thinking about recently, but also from this book. So I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from it towards the end of the chapter. While the ability to interpret sound and attribute likely causes to them is learned culturally so as to instruct on the particular danger to each species, it is also argued that this is built on top of an evolutionary hardwired instinct to respond appropriately for the sake of survival to any threat indicated by sound. To prolong survival, it is claimed the body has developed three basic affects in response to fear: the fight, the flight, and freeze responses. These three affects travel down three lines: the line of attack, the line of flight, and the line of fright. Conflict, escape, and immobility. Some commentators have drawn our attention to the contrasting behavior of young humans, how for children, fear comes through the ear rather than the eyes. Even as adults, the effect of noise, strange tones, and powerful amplitudes in intensifying terror are facts taken for granted. Take the siren, for example. Invented by Seebeck in the 19th century, the siren broadcasts distress. It is a centrifugal sound designed to scatter people in its path by pulsing waves of non-linguistic command to disperse a population. A siren obviously signifies alarm, but more interestingly here, its very modulation of frequency produces a state of alert that can undermine and override cognition. Burglar alarms, ringtones, alarm clock, fire alarms, a whole directly effective are signifying semiotics of emergency. A call to action, the inducement of a state of readiness, initiating a kind of technical antiphony. Wake up, run, beware, respond, act. In evolutionary terms, it is taken for granted that the imperatives of the survival of the organism demarcate the primary function of the auditory system. Second wave cyberneticists Hunt Forrester suggested that the auditory system is served by biological means to infer from the sound that are perceived the sources that produce these sounds. When the sources are identified, more clues relating to the state of the kind of its environment are available to an organism. And in a few tenths of a second, it may swing from a state of utter tranquility into one of a dozen or two modes of behavior, depending on what is implied by the presence of a particular source. The story here, the directionality of its chain of events, is a common one that persists into contemporary cognitivist neuroscience. Sound, cognitive classification function of sound to attribute external source and internal subjective emotion, movement, or activation of the body in response to the emotion. However, this model rests on certain problematic presuppositions regarding the relation between mind and body and their activation, between feeling and emotion. The point of departure for an effective analysis is the disjunction between stimulus and response, cause and effect. If affect operates across the nature-culture continuum, problematizing the difference between what is pre-programmed into the body and what are learned responses, then what is meant by an instinctual response to sound? What are so-called instinctual responses sometimes short-circuited in the intensification of joy? And what happens when there is a more complex, non-linear array of sensual environmental conditions at work, when effects become autonomous from causes, when sound evacuate their source, when fear becomes self-producing? So the second book that I'm responding to is this book by Peter Virgo called The Music of Paintings. And it's a book that really traces the relationship between music but music sort of with a capital M, because it focuses on a couple of genres of music, specifically classical music, There are also other kinds of music mentioned, but only in smaller proportion. But it traces that history from Romanticism to more recent times. It concludes kind of with a chapter that focuses a lot on John Cage. So the focus of this book is quite narrow, but it speaks to a kind of a cross-modal desire for people to think about or make linkages between different senses, which is something that I'm interested in. Another book that is really interesting, not a book but a catalog, was an exhibition that the SKM developed called Notation. But that exhibition is not really just on sort of notated music, but it traces the history of the relationship between music and the visual from early animation, actually. So obviously, because it was from SKM, had a very media-specific focus as well. So again, it has a narrow sort of focus, but on a phenomena that I think is like something that we play with. I think as kids we are more ready to imagine these linkages between different sensorial inputs. And obviously one thing that does it, this cross-modal imagination, one medium that deals with it constantly is writing, and especially poetry. And in Chinese language poetry, there are many words that are basically describing scenery and describing landscape, but they do it through the depiction of sound. So that is something that is quite common in classical poetry. And I also bought this book with me, this book of poetry by not classical Chinese poet, but by a Hong Kong-based poet still living, called Jameel. And he is known for very vivid musical imageries in his poetry. A couple of his books are named after music or ideas that has to do with music. So this one is called Mono, as opposed to stereo, and there are it's kind of not easy to describe, especially when you're sort of talking about poetry and in different languages. But a lot of the music that he described is not just sort of talking about imageries of music or the description of music, but there's a rhythm and a musicality to the way that he uses these words as well. He's one of my favorite poets from Hong Kong, and I want to read a poem that he wrote in 1989 called "A Point of Light," which has many sounds in it, but these sounds are also very rich in visual imagination. So there's the sound of a candle, like crackling when it's burning. There's the sound of fireworks, and the sound the people who are witnessing fireworks and watching fireworks, burning of buildings and smokes of buildings. And but a lot of these imageries are channeled through news reports in his poetry. So he's really questioning sort of like how much can people know through experiences that are not personal. Also, so there's that doubt in this poem. And I'm going to try to read it I'm going to read it in Cantonese. 一點光，像一點光，我可以寫下些什麼？關於這世界和這世界太多的人，關於這深奧的城市當中居住的那路神街，這時代發生了什麼事？聽見很多人和機器的聲音，報導新聞和被新聞報導的人，看電視和在電視上被看的人，窗外有煙霧，自這商住大廈的低層升起，消防車響號，穿過比大廈稠密的霓虹。什麼煙霧混合了真實的邊界？人聲喧鬧，我們所能知道的依然稀少。某個煙花閃爍夜，人們愛熱鬧地聚在一起。當時光璀璨，星星向來寥落更暗，獨我房間沒有燈。今夜有蠟燭，不時傳出燈芯燃燒的爆破聲，和桌上一本文集。尚遺留被煙燻過的氣味，文藝頹唐，歷史注釋，行列口號或歌聲一一暗啞，好像這大廈在一場火災之後滅去了一切電力。窗外有燈，還有我的書本前一枚蠟燭，和它微微搖晃的光所照亮的一個月。它看來那麼有約，比可被它燃燒起來的書本更需要被保護，像着一點80年代末尾的火光，有我和它同樣地閱讀。